Kansas, that state in the dead center of the continental U.S. with all the corn. Precious, precious corn. Although it may not look it, Kansas is a state forged in violence. And not the normal kind of violence I assume heralded the arrival of most states. It was a different kind of violence. In the years prior to the Civil War, as the country continued to expand and develop, our government was still trying to figure out how things would work with the institution of slavery as new states were added to the Union. Previously, in 1820, a messy, drawn-out fight in Congress over the statehood of Missouri and its stance on slavery resulted in legislation known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was admitted to the Union and was allowed to be a slave state, but at the same time, slavery was now prohibited in all other territories north and west of Missouri within the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase. Do I have to explain what the Louisiana Purchase is now? If I don't draw the line somewhere, I'll end up talking about migration over the Bering Land Bridge, just to establish something that happened in the 1850s. You know what the Louisiana Purchase is, right? Right, I'll do a video on it, we're moving on. Back to 1854. Congress made the Missouri Compromise obsolete when it passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which gave the decision of slavery over to popular sovereignty, meaning the citizens of these territories could vote to decide if their new state would adopt slavery or outlaw it. Now, the institution of slavery was still very much alive and well in the United States at this time, but not as ubiquitously accepted as it was in colonial days. The anti-slavery movement had picked up steam and the issue had become pretty divisive among Americans. Like, the most divisive issue. Yes, even more than that one. After the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all U.S. territories were suddenly forced to have personal reckonings on the slavery debate, as they became the battlefield where human rights in America would be shaped. Well, until slavery was just outlawed nationwide a few years later, but anyway. The primary flashpoint in this story is, you guessed it, Kansas. Hence the name of this period of upheaval, Bleeding Kansas. Remember how I said Teapot Dome Scandal is probably an indie rock band? Well, Bleeding Kansas is definitely a metal band. Pro and anti-slavery activists? I guess we can call them activists for the time being until they start killing people. Pro and anti-slavery activists flock to Kansas territory with the intent of steering it toward their ideology. Now, it sounds kind of insane for people to move somewhere for the express purpose of voting on a single issue, but really, can you think of a more important question to answer in US politics than, is it okay to own people? Anti-slavery proponents called abolitionists found the practice to be irredeemably cruel and immoral. Well, some of them did. Most of them were just part of the free soil movement, which hated the plantations that ran on slavery because they would snatch up all the good farmland. And also they didn't really want to live near all the black people. So, yay abolitionists. The pro-slavery crowd, on the other hand, viewed slavery as part of God's bounty to the white race and absolutely critical to their livelihoods. So that's how this was such a big deal to so many. And did I mention that everyone brought their guns? Everyone brought their guns. Tipping the ideological scale of Kansas through invasion was a lot easier to do for the pro-slave movement because the territory was farish away from the settled North, but shared a border with the established slave state of Missouri. Anti-slavery lobbyists established the New England Emigration Aid Company and sent 1,200 Northerners to Kansas, but it was kind of hard to compete with thousands of Missourians walking into Kansas on Election Day to vote it into pro-slavery status. Only half the voters in the election were even registered to vote, and even less than that were actual residents of Kansas. So, yeah, about the quality you'd expect in a highly contentious election held on the frontier in the 1850s. Or, modern-day Florida. The Missourians, or border ruffians as they were called, yeah, border ruffians, key term. The Missourians did it again for the next election, which decided the state legislature, and it looked like slavery in Kansas was off to the races. Hating the direction the territory had gone with its hardline pro-slavery government and legislation in the works, the resident abolitionists formed a second Kansas government based out of the city of Topeka. So basically, this is like a mini civil war playing out just before the big one. Only this time the federal government sided with the pro-slavery faction, recognizing them as the one official government of the territory, even though a congressional investigation revealed Kansas elections marred with widespread fraud and voter intimidation. The civility of the situation unraveled quickly as settlers from opposing sides began killing and tar and feathering one another. Eventually, a mob of pro-slavery settlers took things up a notch when they burned down the Free State Hotel in the town of Lawrence and vandalized buildings, including the local newspaper press. This crossed a line for John Brown, a radical abolitionist with a chip on his shoulders. He retaliated for the act, leading a posse into a Potawatomi Creek settlement to kill 5 arbitrary pro-slavery men. Back and forth violence sparked across Kansas, and even a pro-slavery senator beat another senator senseless with a cane on the Senate floor. John Brown organized another attack, this time a raid on Harpers Ferry, which is nowhere near Kansas. The plan was to capture the federal armory to arm slaves and start an insurrection. They pulled off the first part, at least for a day or two, until they were captured by state and federal soldiers led by none other than Robert E. Lee, the man who would become the leader of the Army of the Confederate States of America. John Brown and his surviving posse were tried for treason and hanged. Whatever people thought about his methods, the anti-slavery movement now had a martyr. Meanwhile, back in Kansas, federal troops were called in by the governor, but the violence did not end immediately. At least 55 people were believed to have died in skirmishes throughout bleeding Kansas. But back to the big picture. Now, before a territory can become a state, it has to form a state constitution. Kansas's pro-slavery constitution, called the Lecompton Constitution, the one written by legislators voted into office by Missourians, had to be submitted to the Kansas Territory voters. This time, voters rejected slavery in a decisive landslide, and the government had to form a new constitution scrapping slavery from the document. The plot to make Kansas a slave state was officially defeated. When Kansas was finally able to apply for statehood, the pro-slavery congressmen in Washington dragged their feet on the vote, and they weren't able to become a state until just after the South started seceding from the Union, meaning the Kansas statehood vote went over much easier once all the opposition left Congress for the Confederacy. I'd say having the opposition spontaneously evaporate from Congress is everyone's dream scenario. That is, if it wasn't because of, a civil war.